Most of the videos I make on this channel fall into one of two broad categories: horror and the paranormal, or true crime. These two genres often overlap, but I think this is the first video I've done that falls squarely into both categories. This is the story of a brutal murder in a small town that remains unsolved over 100 years later, and the supposed hauntings that plague the house where it happened. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders. Villisca is a small town in southern Iowa, and when I say small, I mean small. The population today is estimated to be just over 1,500. I used to live in a town about this size, and if that town is anything like Villisca, not a lot goes on there. But Villisca does have one dubious claim to fame. This event happened all the way back in 1912, when the population was just slightly bigger, at about 2,500. East 2nd Street was a quiet residential street, and the house at 508 East 2nd Street belonged to the Moore family. Josiah and Sarah Moore had been married since 1899 and had lived in the house since 1903. The couple lived there with their 4 children: 11-year-old Herman, 9-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul. From all accounts, the Moores seemed to have a relatively normal life. Josiah had just gone into business for himself, and the couple attended the local Presbyterian church. But their happiness wouldn't last. On the night of Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the family attended a Children's Day celebration at their church, which was organized by Sarah. The program ended around 9:30 p.m., and the Moores walked home. But they weren't alone. 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister Ina were friends with the Moore's daughter Catherine, and they didn't want to walk back to their grandmother's alone in the dark, so they were going to spend the night with the Moores. It's estimated that the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters got back to 508 East 2nd Street between 9:45 and 10 p.m. That was the last time anyone ever saw them alive. Around 5 a.m. on the morning of June 10th, the Moore's next-door neighbor, Mary Peckham, went outside to do laundry. Around 7, she realized she hadn't seen or heard anyone in the Moore house, which was unusual. She knocked on the door but got no response, and when she tried to open it, it was locked, which was also strange. So she let their chickens out and called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. At first, she asked if the Moores had been planning a vacation or anything else that might have explained their absence. But apparently they weren't, and Ross was seemingly alarmed because he arrived at the house just a few minutes later. Once he arrived at the house, Ross tried to get someone's attention by looking at a bedroom window and then knocking on the door and shouting. When there was no response, he unlocked the door with one of his keys and went inside. Everything seemed normal until he reached the downstairs bedroom. When he opened the bedroom door, he saw dark stains and 2 bodies on the bed. The bodies turned out to be those of the Stillinger sisters. Their skulls had been crushed, and Lena's underwear had been removed, and her body posed in a way that seemed sexually suggestive. Fortunately, most sources say she was not sexually assaulted. Ross ran back outside to Mary, who was standing on the porch, and told her to call the sheriff. The city marshal arrived at the house soon afterward and found the bodies of the entire Moore family in the upstairs bedroom. Just like the Stillinger sisters, their skulls had been crushed. The murder weapon, an axe, was later found in the bedroom that had been occupied by the Stillinger sisters. The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. All of the curtains in the house had been drawn, and the 2 windows in the house that didn't have curtains had been covered with the Moore's bedclothes. I believe the victims' faces were also covered. All of the victims were thought to be asleep when they were killed, and it's been speculated that the killer hid in an upstairs bedroom while waiting for everyone to go to sleep. Around 8:15 that morning, Dr. J. Clark Cooper arrived at the house. He estimated that the murders had occurred around midnight. The coroner, Dr. Lindquist, got there around 9. He found 2 slabs of bacon in the house, one near the axe and another in the icebox. It's not entirely clear what these were for, but they were thought to be used as a masturbatory aid. And if this video wasn't demonetized already, it is now. But doctors and investigators weren't the only people at the scene. News of the murder traveled fast in the small town, and several dozen, maybe even up to 100 people traipsed in and out of the house before it was finally cordoned off around noon, hours after the city marshal had arrived. A local druggist who tried to photograph the scene, I assume for evidence, was promptly kicked out. As far as I could find, he was the only person who took any sort of crime scene photos. But even if there hadn't been contamination at the crime scene, which was apparently pretty common back then, there wasn't a lot for investigators to go on. There were no footprints at the scene, no witnesses, and no fingerprints. Fingerprinting was a relatively new thing at the time, so even if fingerprints had been found, there wasn't a national database of any sort where they could be stored. And the Moores weren't the only people who had been killed in this manner. Between 1911 and 1912, there was a string of axe murders across the Midwest, most of which still remain unsolved. In most of these murders, the weapon was found at the scene and the victims were in bed at the time. Many of their houses were also near railroads, and in several of the cases, the killer stayed at the house after the murders. Another string of crimes I thought about when researching this case were the murders of the New Orleans Axeman. I already talked about these in a previous video. These murders occurred a little later, between 1918 and 1919 in New Orleans. Some people believe they may have started as early as 1911, though that is just a theory. I haven't found anything at all to suggest these murders were connected to the axe murders in the Midwest, but I do wonder if it's possible. Now let's get into some of the many suspects in the Villisca axe murders, as well as more speculation that they might have been the work of a serial killer. Early on in the case, there was speculation that the crimes had been committed by a drifter or transient. According to this theory, the killer got away with the murders simply because they can never be found. By the time the bodies were found, they could have been out of Villisca entirely, and as long as they stayed away from the town, they could have avoided suspicion. I talked about this a little bit in my Santa Rosa hitchhiker video because there was similar speculation in that case. However, I don't think that's the case here. Even if the murderer had stayed in Villisca their entire lives, I think a combination of things like crime scene contamination and lack of physical evidence would have helped them get away with it anyway. The next suspect I want to talk about is Joe Ricks. Like many of the men on this list, he was never officially considered a suspect, but his name has been brought up quite a bit in the years following. A few days after the murders, Ricks stepped off a train in Mansfield, Illinois, nearly 400 miles away from Villisca. His shoes were covered in blood. He would later say he got these shoes from a tramp he traded with. Apparently, there wasn't anything else that made him look suspicious or caused investigators to look into him further, because that's all the information I could find on him. Lee Van Gilder was Sarah Moore's ex-brother-in-law. Like Joe Ricks, there wasn't anything to definitively tie him to the crime, but he had been in trouble with the law before and was known to be violent. He had previously been married to Sarah's sister and still had bad blood with the family. This would offer a motive, but not much else. The next theory is a bit unusual, but really interesting. In 1917, an Oklahoma pastor named Reverend J.J. Burris came to police with some interesting information. According to Reverend Burris, he was in a hotel in 1913 when a man made a deathbed confession to him, saying he had committed the Villisca axe murders. The Reverend had never seen this man before, but said he looked to be about 25 years old. I'm not sure why the Reverend waited 4 years to tell police about this, and I can't find any information that suggests they even followed up on it. As a former pastor's kid, I was skeptical about this at first. In my dad's 40-plus years of ministry, I don't think he ever was at the deathbed of a stranger. Most sick or dying people he visited were church members. But when I asked him about this, he said hotels in the early 1900s would sometimes offer information about local clergy to guests. Maybe in case they were doing something they shouldn't have and didn't have a clergy member nearby to talk to or confess to. I had never heard of this before, but it would make sense in relation to the rest of the story. There must be something about brothers-in-law because Sam Moyer is the second one on this list. He was the brother-in-law of Josiah Moore, though I'm not 100% sure of the details, like who was married to who. A couple of sources have said Sam threatened Josiah's life in the past, but I couldn't find solid confirmation of this. Regardless, Sam was arrested a few days after the murders, presumably on suspicion of committing them. However, it turned out he was in New Halka, Nebraska, about 80 miles away at the time of the murders. Nowadays, you can make this trip in an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if there was traffic. But in 1912, this probably wasn't feasible, as this was considered a solid alibi, and Sam Moyer was soon let go. Andy Sawyer is one of these so-called transients some people have speculated committed the crime. On the morning after the murders, Andy approached a railroad pile driver in Burlington and asked for a job, which he was given. When he approached his new boss, he was covered in mud and his pants were wet. His boss would also report more strange behavior over the coming days. Andy slept with his axe, frequently brought up the Villisca murders, and said to no one in particular that he would cut their hands off. He also told his boss that he'd been in Villisca the night of the murders and was afraid he would be considered a suspect. After hearing this, his boss turned Andy over to the sheriff. However, as it turns out, Andy was actually in Osceola the night of the murders, which was about 70 miles away from Villisca, so he too was let go. At the time of the murders, Iowa State Senator Frank Jones lived in Villisca and was a member of the Methodist Church there. There was also some bad blood between he and Josiah Moore. Josiah, a farm implement dealer, and Frank Jones used to work together. But when Josiah left and opened up his own store, their relationship began to sour. By 1912, it was so bad that if the two saw each other on the streets, one would cross the street to avoid the other. In a small town like Villisca, this didn't go unnoticed. To make matters worse, there were also rumors that Josiah had had an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law. Naturally, people were quick to point fingers at Frank Jones, and this divided the town. Members at the Methodist Church, where Frank attended, said he was innocent, while the Presbyterians who went to church with the Moores said Frank was guilty. However, people didn't think Frank committed these murders alone. At 57, he wasn't seen as someone who would be capable of brutally murdering 8 people. As the theory goes, Frank hired a man named William Mansfield to do his dirty work. There was plenty of circumstantial evidence, or at least red flags, against William Mansfield. He was suspected in the murders of at least 9 other people, including his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law. I believe these murders were committed 2 years after the Moore murders. Most of the murders he was suspected in were committed with an axe, and the mirrors in the house had been covered, which was also the case in Villisca. The only exception to this was a 1915 case in which a 21-year-old woman was beaten to death with a lead pipe. In addition to all this, a restaurant worker in Shenandoah said he saw William Mansfield the morning after the murders boarding a train. William was arrested in 1916, but there was evidence that placed him in Illinois at the time of the murders. He was soon released. I believe the case was brought before a grand jury, but he wasn't indicted. He ended up filing a lawsuit against Detective James Newton Wilkerson, who had led the investigation against him, and was awarded $2,250. Despite his career as a traveling preacher, George Kelly was no saint. A known sexual deviant, George reportedly hired a stenographer to do his confidential work, and once she was hired, told her she would have to type in the nude. He was also in Villisca the night of the murders, and even attended the same Children's Day service as the Moores. He left town the next morning but returned a week later. He was reportedly obsessed with the murders, even posing as a Scotland Yard detective to gain entry into the Moore house. He was also left-handed, and the killer was thought to be left-handed due to the way blood was splattered in the house. George was arrested in 1917, but only charged with the murder of Lena Stillinger. He confessed to the murders but later recanted. His confession was said to be coerced, and it was withdrawn before the trial started. The trial ended in a hung jury, and he was retried. The second trial ended in an acquittal. Despite the many suspects and arrests in this case, George Kelly is the only person to ever have gone on trial for the murders. In 1931, George Myers, a prisoner in Detroit, confessed to the murders. In prison for burglary at the time, detectives received an anonymous tip about him and brought him in for questioning. He confessed after 5 hours of interrogation. He claimed to have committed the murders because he was paid by a pastor and businessman he connected with. I haven't seen anyone name this man or talk about his identity, though if he was a pastor, it might have been George Kelly, but I have nothing to back that up. The man said he would pay George Myers $5,000 for the crimes. He paid $2,000 up front and said that George would get the rest after he was sure the victims were dead. George left town before daybreak, never collecting the remaining money. He's also denied killing the Stillinger girls. He was given a 14-year sentence a few years later, but I'm not sure what it was for. He was never charged in connection with the Villisca murders. In 2017, father-daughter team Bill and Rachel McCarthy James released their book, The Man from the Train. The book concerned the Villisca murders and the man they believed committed them, Paul Muller. As far as I could tell, Paul Muller is not related to Robert Mueller of the recent Mueller Report fame. There's not much information about Paul Muller out there, but the Jameses scraped together what they could and weaved a narrative of a man who traveled the U.S. in the late 1800s and early 1900s, murdering people with an axe and setting their house on fire. I admittedly haven't read the book, but if this man really committed murders like this, or was at least suspected to, it's not hard to see why he would be a suspect in the Villisca murders. Like I said earlier, the Villisca murders weren't the only ones of their kind. There were about 15 separate axe murders of their kind in the Midwest between 1911 and 1912. DOJ Special Agent M.W. McClaughry thought at least 6 of these murders were the works of a man named Henry Lee Moore, who was not related to the Moore family. Unlike the other suspects listed here, Henry Lee Moore actually was convicted of 2 murders. A few months after the Villisca murders, he killed his mother and grandmother in Missouri with an axe, seemingly over a financial dispute. He was released on parole in 1949. In 1956, his sentence was commuted by the governor. I presume the Missouri governor. After that, we're not really sure what happened to him. He was 82 at the time, so he probably didn't live very long after that. Henry Moore was also suspected in a murder in Colorado in 1911. An entire family, a husband, wife, and 3 children, were all killed with an axe. Another married couple was killed a month after that. Henry Lee Moore is speculated to be responsible for all these murders, though he was never charged. Over the next century, ownership of the former Moore house switched hands at least 7 times. In 1994, it was bought by its current owners, Darwin and Martha Lynn. They restored the house to its 1912 state, including stripping it of electricity and plumbing, and opened it up for tours. I think it still has air conditioning though. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1998. Everyone I've come across in my research seems to think these tours have done the town good. Like I said earlier, all the finger-pointing and accusations after the murders divided the town. Many people left, and the ones who stayed had strong opinions about the case, but were reluctant to talk about it. Once the house was open for tours, it brought back some commerce to the town that people had been reluctant to visit. But if the stories are to be believed, the tour guides and guests are not alone in the house. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it shouldn't come as a surprise to know that the house has acquired ghost stories. House co-owner Martha Lynn keeps a notebook full of experiences from overnight guests, and according to her, almost everyone who has stayed there overnight has had some sort of paranormal experience. Supposed activity includes children's voices during tours, falling lamps, moving ladders, tugging on clothing, and reports of a man with an axe roaming the halls. And the anecdotes are endless. One visitor asked the Stillinger sisters to turn his flashlight on and off, and the flashlight turned on and off by itself. People have also claimed to be trapped in the closet where Lena supposedly hid from the killer. Insert R. Kelly joke here. Others have reported seeing tiny, pale fingers from that door. Footsteps have been heard from upstairs when there was nobody up there, as well as reports of children roughhousing, again apparently when there were no children in the house. Others claim the door in the children's room opened and closed by itself during the night. One visitor claimed they played in the attic with a ghost boy named Paul, the same name as the youngest murder victim. Hey everyone, I just wanted to come on really quick and clarify something in that last section. There are actually two ways to experience the Villisca Axe Murder House. You can book a day tour or you can stay overnight and you basically have the whole place to yourself for the night. I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit later in the video, but I don't think it was necessarily clear when I was just talking about it, and looking back over the footage from that last section, even I was confused, so I thought I would just clarify it in case anyone else was. Although, I'm pretty easily confused, so it might have been perfectly clear, but whatever. In 2010, the house was featured on the show Ghost Adventures. In the house, the host recorded EVPs and believes they got the name Andy on one of them. Remember, Andy Sawyer was one of the suspects in the murders. The team also interviewed two former residents of the house who said they used to hear young girls crying. In 2014, the house was almost home to another tragedy. 37-year-old Robert Stephen Larson Jr. came to the house with a group of friends to do an overnight paranormal investigation. Around 12:45 a.m., he had separated from the group and called out to his friends, who found him stabbed in the chest. He was airlifted to a nearby hospital and eventually made a full recovery. Remember, the murders were thought by investigators to have been committed around midnight, but some people think they were actually committed closer to 12:45 and that there was a supernatural element to this stabbing. If there wasn't and there was something more serious going on with Mr. Larson, I certainly hope he's okay now. But with any good ghost story comes a dose of skepticism. Even if you do believe in the supernatural, there's always the possibility that specific hauntings aren't real. In the 1990s, filmmaker Kelly Rundle visited the house to make his documentary, Villisca: Living with a Mystery. Just looking through the official plot summary, the movie doesn't seem to mention paranormal activity in the house at all. And according to Rundle, there wasn't any. He never experienced paranormal activity in the house, and neither had any of the former owners he talked to. In fact, the first paranormal investigators didn't visit the house until 1999. Remember, it was open for tours in 1994. When Rundle began filming his documentary, there wasn't much talk of paranormal activity in the house at all. Were these reports of ghosts just rumors, maybe started to drum up publicity for the house tours? I'll let you decide that for yourself. Whatever the case, the house continues to operate today as a tourist attraction / mini hotel. A group of up to 6 people can stay in the house overnight for the low price of $428. You can also bring up to an additional 4 people for $75 each. That does seem pretty steep, but on the other hand, you get the whole place to yourself for the night as well as a private tour. People are also said to bring the original axe from the murders into their investigations. I think it's hanging up in the house somewhere, I'm not really sure. Guests are also encouraged to share any photos, video, or recordings they make during their investigations. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical when it comes to EVPs, which is what most of these investigations I found seem to consist of. Most EVP recordings you watch of any investigation will come with subtitles, but when you watch them without subtitles, to me it just usually sounds like gibberish. But there are a couple out there that seem convincing, at least to me. I'll link some videos down below that people have made of their own investigations in the Villisca Axe Murder House, so you can decide for yourself. The case has also found its way into the media. There are tons of books and movies about the case, including Villisca: Living with a Mystery and The Man from the Train, both of which I've mentioned before. A couple other books I found were Morning Ran Red: The Villisca Axe Murders by Stephen Bowman, and Murdered in Their Beds: Dead Men Do Tell Tales by Troy Taylor. Murdered in Their Beds explores the theory that the murders were committed by a transient serial killer. The case has also inspired a few movies. Of course, there was also Villisca Living with a Mystery, which didn't seem to have anything to do with the paranormal. There are a couple of other movies about the case, but they're not documentaries and seem to focus more on the supernatural aspect. Among them are Haunting Villisca, which was actually filmed in Villisca, and The Axe Murders of Villisca. The latter movie goes with the premise that George Kelly committed the murders and had a sexual motive. It transforms pretty quickly into a typical supernatural teen horror movie, which, if you're into horror, you've probably seen the same thing 100 times. But if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, purchase links for everything, as always, are down below. So, what do you think of this case? Who do you think is responsible for the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls? Do you think any of the murders mentioned in this video were committed by the same person? Do you think the Moore's former home is really haunted, or do you just think it was rumors started maybe to drum up publicity? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and share it. And for more dark content, I hope you will consider subscribing and hitting that bell. Don't forget, The Revenants is now available in ebook and paperback, and there's a link down below where you can purchase it or any of my other books. If I sell enough books, maybe I can afford to stay a night in the Villisca Axe Murder House. Also, a few people have asked me if I'll be selling signed copies of my books, or if they'll ever be available to buy anywhere outside of Amazon. That's something I'd like to do in the future, and I'm working on it. It might take a while, but keep an eye out for updates. Thanks for watching, and have a creepy day. Bye guys.